Hello again, history fans. Welcome to this module's document discussion. Today we have three documents to discuss: FDR's Executive Order 9066, Richard Nixon on the American Standard of Living, and Joseph McCarthy on communism. So if you have those, go ahead and get those out. First, we're just going to go chronologically. We're going to start with our World War II document, the Executive Order 9066. You saw in our lecture that we discussed internment of Japanese, and this is the document that started that. So we're gonna go through this kind of paragraph by paragraph. So first paragraph, right off the bat, he says, by virtue of the authority vested in me as president, commander-in-chief, I authorize Secretary of War and the military commanders and those people that they have power over. Okay, who is this for? Who is this document for? This is for the war measure. This is a war measure. He says that this is an issue of military necessity. This is what we have to do to win the war. I am putting out this particular executive order as commander-in-chief of the military. He does that very intentionally because, like we saw in World War I, also in World War II, there is this era of super patriotism where everybody is 100% behind the war effort. And if he says to the public, if FDR says to the public that this thing, no matter how controversial or weird it might sound, is necessary for winning the war, then people are going to get behind it. People are going to do it, no matter what it is. So he comes out right off the bat and says that this is a war effort to get people behind it. Second paragraph, he says, I authorize Secretary of War and military commanders to take such steps and enforce compliance, including the use of federal troops and other federal agencies. So who's going to enforce this executive order? Troops, the military. So, okay, if you're a Japanese American citizen and the army comes knocking at your door and says, hey, you've got 3 days to sell all your stuff and report to the registration center. Okay, thanks. You're not really going to be able to argue very effectively with that. They're enforcing it by use of military troops. Kind of a trick question. Who is this document for? It never says, does it? Everybody knows, like it's kind of an open secret, that this is supposed to be for the Japanese Americans, first and second generation Japanese. However, it never comes right out and says that. So a couple of reasons. One, FDR doesn't want to make it too obvious that he is oppressing a certain specific group of people. That's true. But it's also true that the Japanese were not the only people interned during World War II. By far the most popular, the majority of people who were interned were Japanese, but there were also some German Americans. There were also some gays and lesbians. Let's not forget about those people. So he leaves it vague so that the military has some wiggle room. It's a built-in loophole. Executive Order 9066. Bleh. Let's go on. Our next pair of documents, think of them as a pair. Think of them together. Joseph McCarthy on communism and Richard Nixon on the standard of living. Let's actually take Joseph McCarthy first. In this document, Joseph McCarthy is a senator. He's a senator from Virginia. And he's kind of infamous for giving this particular speech in 1950. This is the first time that he gave this speech in Wheeling, Virginia in 1950. He gives this same speech later, again and again and again, repeatedly, where it changes slightly. So we'll talk about how in a second. The first thing that I want you to pull out of this document is on the first page, he's really characterizing the two sides at war in the Cold War. Now, remember, we said that the Cold War is never the Soviet Union and the US facing off against each other, against the battlefield, or not shooting bullets. It is instead a war of ideology, a war of ideas. The US is a capitalist country. They think that capitalism will be the best way to organize society for the world, best model for the rest of the world. The Soviet Union is communist. They think that that is an economic system that will provide the best model for the rest of the world to follow. So they have different economies, first and foremost. But on the first page of this document, Joseph McCarthy also talks about some other things that make them different. He says that communism is atheistic, and therefore the obvious opposite of that, yes, that's sarcasm, is that the United States is Christian. So here's one other way that Joseph McCarthy and others are wanting to portray the Cold War as a competition between black and white, us versus them. There is no gray area. Communists are atheists, capitalists are Christian. He also says that capitalists and Christian are democratic. They have liberty. They have the right to vote. They have the freedom of information and freedom of speech and all the rest of the freedoms. And communist atheists do not. They have tyranny. So, okay, so if you want to like think about it in a little chart, right? There's two sides, the US and the Soviet Union, and each of these has a certain economic system, a certain religious system, and a certain government system. The US is capitalist, believes in private ownership. Government doesn't owe you anything. There are classes. Capitalist. The US is also Christian nation. The US is also a democratic nation where people have voting rights and a voice in the government. On the other hand, McCarthy characterizes the Soviet Union as a communist country without freedom, with tyranny, and is atheist. On the second page, the other thing that I want you to pull out of this document is that, well, actually, maybe before we start there, let me say a note about the Christianity bit. Sometimes in today's world, you hear that phrase, America's a Christian nation. Maybe, but it wasn't always. It became one in the 1950s, largely because of documents like this and ideas like this. When McCarthy comes out and he is trying to characterize the US and the Soviet Union as these two completely different armed camps, as he calls them, he wants America to become a Christian nation to build consensus within the country and to further differentiate it from communist Soviet Union. So the 1950s is the era where faith becomes tied to foreign policy. There historically hadn't been a lot of support or will feeling between Jews and Catholics and Protestants in America. America was a Protestant nation and they didn't really like Jews or Catholics very much. But in the 1950s, this is where we see the idea of the Judeo-Christian tradition, where there's this notion that Jews and Catholics and Protestants all pray to the same God. They all have the same general basic ideas. They just have some small differentiations. This is the period where we see the words "under God" added to the pledge, "one nation under God." That hadn't been there previously. This is the period where we see the words "in God we trust" added to the money. So if you pull out money right now, bills or coins, you're going to see the words "in God we trust." That hadn't been there before. Now it is. So in the 1950s, faith is tied to foreign policy. The American federal government and the American people are trying to build consensus among themselves to differentiate them from supposed communist atheism. All right, so that's the first page. Now, if we go on to the second page, McCarthy in his speech is talking about the enemy and where the enemy is. He says the enemy has sent men, past tense, it's already happened, has sent men to invade our shores. It's not been the less fortunate or members of minority groups, but rather those who have had all the benefits that the wealthiest nation on earth has had to offer. And then he holds up a piece of paper when he's given this speech, and he says, "I have in my hand 57 cases of individuals who are card-carrying members of the Communist Party." And remember, I said he gives the speech several times, right? So the first time it's 57, and the next time it's 63, and the next time after that it's 75. I don't know, I'm making up numbers. But the point is, like, every time he gives this speech, the number keeps going up. And so people start getting really worried, and they start getting really paranoid, and they keep saying, "Oh my God, the more McCarthy investigates, the more communist spies he finds. This is such a huge problem." And so people start getting really hysterical and really paranoid, and they become convinced that American federal government, not just America, not just like local government even, but the federal government, the State Department, is just infested with communist spies and saboteurs. The State Department, the highest echelons of power, the people who make all of the decisions, the people who hold all of the purse strings, the people with all of the influence, are riddled with communist spies, supposedly. So all of this paranoia and drama is called McCarthyism, sometimes called a witch hunt. McCarthy becomes so popular in the short term. And he is given control of HUAC, HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is a House Un-American Activities Committee. This is a joint committee of Congress, starts in the House, hence the name. And it is charged with investigating people who are supposed communists. So basically, anybody who leans a little bit left of center, with some enemies somewhere, can be brought up on charges of supposed communist involvement and investigated by HUAC. They're grilled in front of the congressional community. They lose their reputations, they lose their good names, they lose their jobs, they're blacklisted, so they can't get a job anywhere else. They lose their lives and their livelihoods, all because of paranoia and drama. As it turns out, there weren't 57 cases or any other number of communist spies in the United States government. There was a grand total of 1. So yeah, okay. There was 1 communist spy in the federal government, and that's a problem. But they found him, and they found him very early, and he's mentioned in this speech, Alger Hiss. So it's not a big deal, really. It's not anything to ruin the country over. So eventually the second Red Scare, McCarthyism, just sort of dies out because people come to realize that they had been just being paranoid and hysterical. Thank goodness. But not before a lot of people lose their livelihoods, which is a problem. So our last document, Richard Nixon on the American Standard of Living in 1959. I think I talked about in our lecture about how the Soviets and the United States had this pair of exhibitions. And so the Americans had the American exhibition in Moscow, and the Soviets had the Soviet exhibition in New York City. This is a speech given by then Vice President Richard Nixon at the American exhibition in Moscow. So he's talking to the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev. He's giving this speech to the Soviets themselves. Again, 2 things to pull out of this document. On the first page, he is trying to characterize the average American family, and he pulls up a lot of statistics to do that. He says, he starts talking about their wages and how they own a house and a television set and a price range, and they have this many cars, and they have this many radios, and they buy an average of 9 dresses and 14 pair of shoes per family per year. So, okay, he's giving up all of these statistics, all of these specifics to prove that the average American family is really quite wealthy. The average American family is really quite wealthy. They own their home. They own the land that it sits on. They own all of these luxuries like cars and radios. They have plenty of clothes. They own a lot of really nice things. If the goal of communism is to create a classless society where everybody's roughly equal, capitalism is actually the best way to do that. Capitalism has done that, says Nixon. This is not Elise Webb talking, right? This is not Dr. Webb. This is Richard Nixon. He says capitalism is actually the best way to create a classless society. The average American family is quite wealthy, he says. On the second page, he starts to address supposed problems of capitalism. Something that the communists had been doing in their exhibition was bringing up a lot of problems with capitalism and shortcomings of capitalism, ways that communism was better than capitalism. And so here Nixon is trying to address the supposed problems, and he's actually saying, no, these aren't problems at all. We've solved these problems. So the first problem is that of unemployment. Communism guarantees people a job. Capitalism does not. So unemployment is a thing. Richard Nixon says, no, that's actually not a problem. We've solved that because in the 1930s, we created Social Security. And so if people do become employed, they have unemployment insurance so they can draw out and get them through and pay their bills until they find another job. Problem solved, he says. One of the other supposed problems with capitalism, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth paragraph down, is that it doesn't care for the aged or the sick. So again, communism guarantees certain things for its citizens. Capitalism doesn't not. But he says, no, the other part of Social Security is an old age pension. If you're too old to work, you retire, and you pull out the money that you pay. So Social Security, we've solved it. Well done, go us. Another problem, the next paragraph, communism likes to point out strikes as being a problem that plagues capitalism. And he says, no. Nixon says, strikes are actually a good thing. Strikes mean that capitalism is working. Strikes mean that workers have a voice in their workplace. Oh. So maybe no, the government doesn't owe you a job under capitalism, but workers have a voice. And if they aren't happy with their conditions or with their hours or with their pay, if they aren't happy with the way that they're being asked to work, then they don't have to. They can collectively organize and go on strike and negotiate better conditions. Strikes mean that capitalism is working. It's not a problem that affects capitalism. And then the last one, my personal favorite, something that communism likes to point out as a problem with capitalism is that it makes it very easy for racial discrimination to happen. The issue of racial discrimination. So if the government doesn't owe you a job or owe you a place to stay, then there aren't going to be enough jobs or enough houses to go around, and some people aren't going to get them. And so it seems like the people who go without are always racial minorities. Nixon doesn't really have a whole lot to say on that one, does he? He says, oh, yeah, we know racial discrimination is a thing in our country, and we are making great progress. He says, that's the quote. We are making great progress. We're working on it. To be determined, says Nixon. He doesn't really address that one too well, but he does say, that they know it exists and that he's working on it. It's in the works. So partial credit, I guess, on that one. So, okay, the thing I hope you pull out of Richard Nixon is he's pointing out the American standard of living is quite high, that the average American is quite wealthy, that capitalism is actually the best way to create a classless society where everybody is roughly equal, and that all of the supposed problems with capitalism have actually been solved. It's not a problem. Hooray. So I hope that you found this discussion helpful for these 3 documents. Have a good day. Don't work too hard. Bye.